Hello. I'm delighted to have been invited to speak at the Seoul Education Policy Institute on your really important conference on post-COVID-19 scenarios in society and in education in particular. My name's Andy Hargreaves. I'm a professor at Boston College and also at the University of Ottawa. I've been writing opinion pieces about COVID-19, not just from my own experience, but also because I'm president of an organization I co-founded 5 years ago called the ARC Education Project. We bring together 7 or 8 ministers every year, and also in meetings in between ministers of education and also professional leaders to promote common values of equity, broad excellence, inclusion of all identities, well-being, democracy, and human rights in professionally run systems. Values that South Korea is particularly attached to and increasingly moving towards over time. So it's really on this collective knowledge that I draw, as well as the knowledge of other organizations such as the OECD, Education International, and so on, in speaking to you today. We've been through an extraordinary period in the last few months. We've been through a period when almost 200 countries have taken their children out of school, well over a billion children. And almost every country in the world has been affected by this extraordinary pandemic that we call the new coronavirus or COVID-19, the largest pandemic for 100 years. The last one, by the way, in 1918, 1919, is, amongst other things, is what gave rise to my mother's name. My mother, Doris Hargreaves, was the daughter, the first and only daughter of William Kenyon, and he was in the Spanish flu, as it was called then, of 1918, 1919, and nursed through sickness over a long period by what we would now call an essential worker. Her name was Doris, so my mother has a legacy, really, our family does, from the last pandemic before this one. It's had an incredible impact, really, on our schools as well as our society, and it feels in many ways that we've been going through a long dark tunnel, are still going through a long dark tunnel. South Korea has coped better than many countries, and we look to South Korea for rigor of testing, of tracing, and following up. We look to South Korea for leadership that is both coordinated, decisive, evidence-based, and collaborative, all at the same time. We look to South Korea for a country that has had a clear strategy on technology, which has made it universally available pretty much to everybody in a country that already has a lot of access, not dependent on ability to pay and ability to access, unlike many other countries that have high inequality in the digital divide and in other areas. And we look to South Korea because of the way in which you assigned one teacher basically in every school to participate in networks so that teachers could be the first responders to their children's learning needs and their children's well-being concerns. But they could also do this in a coordinated, collective way. It was not left to the individual whim of the teacher or to a centralized top-down strategy. So South Korea's coped better than most the rest of the world thinks at this particular time. The question is what is coming next? What is at the end of the tunnel? And which way should we turn when we come through it? We've been in a pandemic tragedy, and if we look at the sign taken from one of my hiking trips, this comes from Wales, the country. On one way, it feels like we've been coming from the world's end, and on the other way, let's hope that this is not where we're continuing to go, but we're headed for a panorama, a broad, wide, inclusive view of what may lie ahead of us. Many people think that the way that we will take next will be a way driven by the economy, driven by austerity with high taxes and cutting of government services on the general population, with consequences, of course, for public education. But as Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor for President Bill Clinton, said, there is nothing inevitable about austerity. There are other strategies as well as cutting government services and taxing income. We can tax wealth, for example. We can see state expenditure as an investment, a way to create jobs, not somehow try to take care of the economy by removing those jobs. And so in this way, we start to think that the post-COVID scenario perhaps should follow what new economists, many of them women, are saying. People like Mariano Mazzucato or Kate Raworth, who invented what's called the donut strategy for societal growth. They argue that we shouldn't really measure ourselves primarily or predominantly by gross domestic product, by how we can increase it so that we can tax more people who earn it through their income. We shouldn't be too obsessed with the performance of one country related to another as the main measure of how effective we are, but rather we should be thinking about quality of life as a major indicator of how we perform and achieve. And the value of everything. This is what Mariano Mazzucato argues. And many political leaders are following the thinking of economists like this. They include Katrin Jacobs-Dottir, the Prime Minister of Ireland, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, and other leaders of countries like Denmark and Canada, Justin Trudeau in Canada, are moving closely behind them. Nicola Sturgeon herself talks about how the goal and the objective of all economic policy should be collective well-being. It should not be growth for its own sake. And indeed, the original meaning of prosperity rather than austerity is not financial wealth. It basically simply means living well, living in a fulfilling way. So the ARC Education Group of Nations is about these kinds of values. Economists now, leading edge economists, are promoting these values, and so are some of our world leaders. In South Korea, in books that I've had translated into Korean, here's my translator in front of you now, on a visit I took last October, has been seeing this in terms of what my colleague Dennis Shirley and I a few years ago called the fourth way of educational change. The first way was really about teachers with individual autonomy, doing what they wished when they wanted, innovating in some places, but no cohesion or coordination of effort across them. And the second way was about markets, competition, standardization, and testing. When this book was translated, many people in South Korea looked at it and looked at the national system. They said, yes, this is where our national system is. This is why we've become a little bit obsessed about our high PISA scores every year. It's why We have our hag ones. It's why there's extraordinary and sometimes self-harmful competition to get into the three elite Sky universities. The pedagogies have become very traditional because they've been focused on these kinds of goals. And as we see from OECD's data on well-being, which looks at the relationship between tested educational achievement and also well-being. South Korea is with a group of other Asian countries and also the UK, where I was born and brought up, in being in a cell that has very quite high performance, but also very low quality of life, low quality of well-being. So many provinces among the 17 districts in South Korea, particularly the one in Seoul, the one surrounding Seoul, but many others as well, have tried to focus on what Dennis Shirley and I call a fourth way of educational change, focusing on humanitarian values, on dignity, on social justice, on democracy, on quality of life and well-being, and on a system that promotes innovation in many schools in the district surrounding Seoul. I've had my attention brought to over 1,000 schools in a network of innovative schools, and I know that Seoul itself is innovating in the same kind of proportions. So South Korea is in some kind of battle or tussle federally and provincially between being in this second way of market standardization, testing, hag ones, traditional pedagogy, and more humanitarian values about quality of life, about innovation, and about different ways of approaching teaching and learning. And this is also how we really need to think about what's coming after coronavirus, what it is that we will do next. And I have a simple diagram here to try and outline what the at least two of the scenarios might be. The more likely one, pushed by a number of governments, by traditional economists, by a number of political leaders who are mostly driven by GDP in more market-run systems, by a number of thought leaders, by economically driven organizations, is really on the left-hand side. And this is a strategy of imposing austerity, cutting back public services to try and reduce the debt, possibly increasing taxation of income amongst lower and middle income earners in particular. And we know from the last period of austerity after the global economic collapse what devastatingly harmful consequences these things can have for poverty, for children, and for inequality. Compared to, say, finding ways to tax the extremely wealthy, the 1% in the world, tax their wealth, not income, because the 1% own more than 50% of the world's wealth. And here we include Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, the owners of large technology companies. And so it's not surprising that in this scenario, a Bloom comes before Maslow, learning comes before well-being, and we know just how important well-being has turned out to be within the coronavirus pandemic. So technology companies will talk about hybrid learning, about blended learning, about use of more technology, more access to technology at home, more learning at home, more learning anytime, anywhere, any place, more learning that's ubiquitous. And yet, paradoxically, one thing we learned during coronavirus in many countries is how inefficient learning at home was, how parents make very poor, uncertified substitute teachers in most cases. How many young people are easily distracted when they're in crowded family environments with multiple devices, for example, how they miss the care of their teachers, school just as a place to be, so their parents can go to work. So the argument for more technology has little educational merit as a private option, but is one obviously that the technology companies and those who associate with them will be favoring very, very greatly. Linked to this are in one document by Microsoft, for example, you'll see apparently compassionate measures to protect teachers over 55 from impact of coronavirus because they're vulnerable, and to offer them early retirement. And yet this seems not only heartless because many teachers over 55 are in the prime of their career, probably including the presenters on this panel, actually. And and over 55 is not the cutoff, actually, for vulnerability. Over 65 is. If you want to be compassionate to teachers over a certain age during this crisis, offer them other jobs, offer them teaching and working from home, offer them different roles, offer them long-term disability, and yes, offer them early retirement too if they wish, but don't force or push or nudge them into early retirement just because it will allow old expensive teachers to be moved out the way and young inexpensive more flexible ones to be placed there in their stead. And last but not least, we're starting to see that although during coronavirus, there was really no mourning of the loss of educational testing in countries like the United States, Canada, the UK, many others. People missed contact with their peers. People missed the expertise of the teachers. Nobody really missed standardized testing. And there's a strong possibility that we could find a way to live in a world without high stakes testing and the enormous cost that that involves. If you want to make a saving, save on the costs of high stakes testing. And there are some who say, well, we need the testing to see how inequitable things will be after 3 years following the coronavirus. But we have many other ways of doing that than high stakes testing everybody. We can do it through samples, we can do it through formative assessments and so on. So this is panorama one. It's a panorama of imposed austerity, of learning before well-being, of a push gently and then stronger for more and more technology, even though there's no evidence that is especially beneficial, for an erosion of the older end of the teaching force and for a return of high stakes testing. Against this, a second panorama would say that actually instead of austerity, we need investment. Investment because many children will come back to schools having forgotten how to line up, how to sit in a circle, how to listen, how to wait their turn. They'll have been sometimes in families that are highly stressed with many problems. They'll need more care, more counseling, more special education support when they return rather than less, more investment rather than less. So we should make education at least a protected area if there is austerity. And we should really argue that we shouldn't have austerity at all because we need to create jobs for people, and helping children is one of the best things that they can do. We should think about technology. We've discovered that access is unequal in lots of countries, not in South Korea, but like South Korea or Uruguay, for example, we should make technology a public, universal, and free of charge for those who otherwise could not afford it, as a human right, rather than government money going to private companies to enhance their gain in a way that causes inconsistency in access to people who want technology outside of schools within their rights. We need to focus in the immediate years after COVID-19, not on learning anytime, anywhere, ubiquitously, but actually on what children have missed, the here and now, playing outside, being with their friends, being cared for by their teacher, building a community, committing to public good. We need to return to the idea which Asian countries are very strong in having, that public education is about building a society, building a nation, building a community, and not simply about using technology for individual private choice anytime, anywhere, give or take. And we need to think about investing in all our teachers, not just in our younger teachers. And we can save money by not returning to the testing of a high stakes nature that we found that we could easily do without. We have two choices ahead of us. One is the traditional route of increasing GDP, of reducing public services, of saving money from investment in public education, and to have no impact on the 1% who have most of the world's wealth. That is where most of the contribution should now realistically be coming from. The politically easier strategy is to grow GDP, is to tax and cut back on services for everybody, is to reintroduce the testing, is to erode teaching. And as Confucius said, the superior man is the one who understands what is right. We want to avoid being the inferior man or woman who understands what will sell. So let's focus on what's right, on investment, not austerity, on public, universal, free access to technology, on the here and now, and not just anytime, anywhere, on investing in all teaching, high quality teaching, on the basis of which Korea has stood so well for so long, and in its struggle between the second and the fourth way, that not reintroducing testing on a big scale will enable South Korea to move fully to the fourth and not turn back to the second, which has harmed the well-being of its young people over the last decade or two. Thank you for the time for listening to this message, and I hope you have a good and productive Congress for the rest of the Congress. And in time, I hope to return and to be able to work with you, not just anytime, anywhere like now, but here and now, face to face, in community together. Thank you again.